So, agentic AI and agency have become hot topics in the world of artificial intelligence, as ever more of our AI tools go off and take increasingly complex actions in the world on your behalf. At the moment, these tools boost our agency, which at a basic level is great. But it does raise the question of whose agency are they going to boost most and for what? But before we can really dig into these questions, I think we first need to look at how human agency is already a key theme that should run through all our discussions about our political economies. More than just freedom, we should be centering human agency. Let me explain why, and then we'll come back to AI. There's a quote from Martin Wolf's book, The Crisis of Democratic Capitalism, that has really stuck with me. Both liberal democracy and market capitalism share a core value, a belief in the value and legitimacy of human agency in political and economic life. I think this is so true. We understandably focus on individual freedom as one of the founding principles of our liberal societies, and this is absolutely how it should be. But I think we need to extend this principle beyond just having the theoretical freedom to act, but to having real agency to act. For example, someone who is completely penniless might have the freedom to engage with the market, but they have absolutely no means to do so. Similarly, back before the use of secret ballots, politicians would ply voters on polling day with food and drink and coerce them into voting for their party. These voters still had the theoretical freedom to vote for whoever they wished, but now that they were drunk, thankful for the food and being watched as they voted, they had essentially lost their real agency over their choice. Now, of course, these are very simple examples, but hopefully they illustrate the obvious difference between having the legal freedom to do something and having the true agency to take advantage of that freedom. So we must not be so naive as to promote freedom denuded of the agency to act upon it. But human agency is more than just the most legitimate underpinnings of our liberal democracies and market economies. It is at the heart of a key theoretical argument for why these two systems, for two very different domains, can work so effectively. And that is because it is only when the individuals of our society have independent agency that you can get wisdom from their aggregate choices. So, the classic example of the idea of the wisdom of crowds comes from a study published back in 1907, where Francis Galton reported that when he asked 800 people at a livestock fair to guess the weight of an ox, the average of their guesses turned out to be remarkably close to the actual weight. Indeed, the aggregate guess from the whole crowd was more accurate than many of the individual guesses by experts. Over the years, this kind of observation that in some circumstances, crowdsourced answers can be better than the answers of experts has been replicated across a number of different fields. For example, betting prediction markets regularly outperform sports pundits or political pundits. And similarly, the work by Philip Tetlock, such as described in his excellent book Super Forecasting, written with Dan Gardner, shows that the aggregate prediction of open-minded, independent non-experts can often outperform the predictions of experts whose job it is to understand, say, the likelihood of near-term geopolitical events. One possible explanation for the aggregate success of the non-expert guessing of the weight of the ox is that wild underestimates by some people in the crowd will be counterbalanced by wild overestimates by others, so the average ends up being roughly correct. Philip Tetlock's explanation about the successes of groups of super forecasters is more subtle, but all explanations of this kind of phenomenon depend on the idea that it only works when the individuals are making independent choices, that they're not, for example, all being swayed one way or another by some kind of groupthink or coercion. So there is only wisdom in the crowd if it is made up of people with independent agency. And similarly, our foundational myth of why competitive market economies work is because they tap into this wisdom of the crowds in order to establish which products or services are the preferred choices on which people actually do spend their limited resources. That is essentially why this kind of dynamic, bottom-up, crowdsourced approach to resource allocation is considered by many to be far superior to central planning by experts. But crucially, for this logic to hold, it must again be the case that the individuals are acting as well-informed, independent, free agents with a real choice they can make. So, if instead of a competitive market, there's a sector operating as a monopoly, then even well-informed free citizens can only essentially make a forced choice. It is not a choice coming from their agency. So there is no signal here of what their real preferences might be. Similarly, if it's a distorted market, where, for example, the information provided is extremely limited or biased, so that, in this case, the purple citizens all buy the purple product because they're all caught up in some misguided groupthink based on false information. Anyone being heavily manipulated has essentially lost their real agency over their choices, in this case, mindlessly choosing the purple product. So, to get the real benefits of a market economy, it must be a genuinely competitive market, with buyers who can express real independent agency in their choices of what to buy. And, ideally, this kind of healthy, competitive market can have the property of being what Nassim Nicholas Taleb calls anti-fragile, where even though the stresses of competition might make individual products fail, this can actually strengthen the market as a whole if sellers have the freedom and indeed agency to bring innovative or creatively different products to the market. Look, I know that this is all leaning in uncritically to the idealized myth and is far from how many actual markets work. But I wanted to highlight the central role of human agency in the theoretical justifications for capitalist free markets. This also highlights the crucial role that the state has to play in order to try to make sure that these conditions are the case, that monopolies don't form, that the public is well educated, and that sellers of products provide good, clear information about their products. And indeed, to ensure that public discourse has a range of independent voices who are free to disagree, free to criticize or praise products and companies. And, just to note, we know that the companies participating in markets can't be trusted to do this task themselves, because they tell us repeatedly that competition is for losers. If you want to make the most profits, you don't want the public to have agency, critically and independently appraising your products. You want them to be robots, buying your brand on instinctive reflex. So the state has a vital role to play to protect and promote our genuine agency. But to keep the state honest, it must be run by and for the people with democratic oversight. Of course, a healthy liberal democracy has many other aspects to it than just voting. But as with competitive markets, democratic voting should be another way to take advantage of the wisdom of crowds. But again, you'll only get wisdom from the crowd if the individual citizens have real independent agency over the voting choices that they're making. So all the same arguments about the dangers of monopolies and bias apply just as much to democratic voting as well. That's why no individual voice within the community should dominate and manipulate the public discussion, and no external voice either. There's no wisdom from manipulated groupthink, so we should be promoting and protecting individuals' informed, free agency over their political choices. And just like with markets, I would say that a healthy democracy should also be anti-fragile in the sense that the stresses of public debate and subsequent voting should mean that every now and then some parties disappear and get replaced by newer parties with new ideas. Well, that should be what happens, but unfortunately, here in the UK, and also in the USA, for the last 100 years or so, the first-past-the-post voting system has essentially stopped that, locking us into a two-party duopoly that really isn't great, and strips voters of having true agency to express their political choices. It's about time we upgrade our democracies. So, where have we got to? I hope I've shown why human agency can be seen as a core pillar of our political economies, not just because it's a good in itself, but also because genuine agency underpins our theoretical conceptions of both democracy and healthy market economies. But it is not as if we all have the same level of agency over our lives. We've probably all heard stories about incredible young individuals who just seem to hit the ground flying, teaching themselves all sorts of skills, but also connecting to other people and building businesses with natural flair. Some people just seem to be gifted with a high level of agency. On the other hand, especially in this age of mass distractions, there are others who seem to be at the opposite extreme, lazing around on the couch all day with no real idea of what to do with their lives. But looking along another dimension, extreme levels of wealth can give individuals extraordinary levels of agency, not only over their own lives, but also over other people's lives too, both by paying for things to happen and by paying to influence our politics. Whereas extreme poverty, and indeed drug addiction, can rip all semblance of agency away from people who were once highly capable, highly agentic individuals. So we can imagine a whole set of different factors that can affect our level of agency throughout our lives, such as our level of education. If we don't understand the world, we can't sensibly decide how to act in the world. Our level of wealth, obviously. Our personal drive. Our emotional intelligence. How persuasive are you? Our network of social contacts. Whose help can you draw on? Our physical and mental health, and so on. Most of these we can work on ourselves and change over time, boosting our own agency. But then there are also external factors that impact our level of agency, such as our society's level of political freedom to think, speak, and act in the world, our personal safety, freedom from physical or psychological coercion or manipulation in our personal lives, the availability in our society of accurate and timely information, what you could call the information landscape. And crucially, to have agency, we need to have genuine alternative choices that we can make. By going through all of these different factors that impact our agency over our lives, I hope it's clear why I see agency as a useful prism through which we can think about the impacts of almost all public policies. How does a policy boost individual agency, or protect our agency, or diminish our agency? And then, if we crudely imagine that the distribution of levels of agency roughly mirrors the distribution of some of the key factors like education and wealth, then it is reasonable to expect that the levels of agency in our society will be very uneven, with only a few people having the combination of factors that give them extremely high agency, and in comparison, the majority of people having relatively lower levels of genuine agency over their choices and actions. And this matters because, as we all know, many of those with the highest levels of agency, usually because of their wealth and power, often try to use their influence over the world to suppress or distort the agency of others, to establish monopolies, to limit political choices, to flood social media with false narratives. That's essentially the world we live in today. And the point I'm making here is that this isn't just unfair. These distortions undermine the theoretical argument for why market economies and democracies ought to work well in the first place. It diminishes the possibility of there being aggregate wisdom in the crowd. So we already have a major political task ahead of us if we do want to protect and promote human agency and thereby have a healthy democracy overseeing a healthy, anti-fragile market economy that is thriving with creativity. So what happens to all this as AI tools increasingly boost human agency? There are lots of different possible scenarios of how AI is going to progress from where we are today, and I've looked at a range of such scenarios in another video that should be linked to above. But here, we're going to stick with the most plausible default scenario where, at least in the short to medium term, AI systems mostly just work as fantastic tools that boost human agency in particular domains, boosting our ability to get done what we want to do. Now, at first glance, this might sound like it's all good, as it could lift the agency of everyone. In particular, It could boost those with relatively lower agency to be more able to find and assess the options in front of them and make good choices and get stuff done. I don't doubt that this will happen to some degree, which is unquestionably good. But there are a lot of potential risks that we shouldn't be blind to. For example, there's a very real risk that because most of these AI tools are being funded by large capitalist interests, they could easily be designed as tools of influence, pushing the commercial or political interests of their corporate owners, rather than even trying to be neutral tools that genuinely support the agency of the end user. They could be designed to give us the illusion of choosing, while deliberately manipulating us, not boosting human agency at all, but subverting it. The second problem is that today, the best way to get these tools to be useful is if you already have some idea about the subject at hand, and some idea about what you'd like to get done. And indeed, you need to want to engage with these tools to learn about what they can do. Or in other words, those who already have higher agency are likely to get much more of a boost from these tools than someone with lower agency. And probably the most serious danger to society from the way these tools will boost human agency comes from the fact that using these tools costs money, a lot of money. And yes, these costs are coming down rapidly. But I don't think the dynamic of these tools is like that of other tech. A classic tech example people often refer to is the way that mobile phones were once expensive and exclusive, but over time they became cheaper while becoming vastly better as well. The difference is that you really only need one mobile phone, but it is likely that for those who know how to use them, the benefits of AI agents will scale the more you are able to use them. So those with a lot of wealth will be able to spin up hundreds or thousands of full-time AI agents to, say, run a company for them, or to run political influence campaigns, or whatever. And indeed, the benefits of having wealth when using AI will be even more pronounced when it comes to AI robots that can take physical actions in the world. So yeah, these AI tools will boost our agency, but it will do so disproportionately. And I think there are two groups of people who are likely to benefit the most. Firstly, those with existing wealth. And secondly, those with a high level of natural agency, those who are quick at self-learning and who just crack on to get things done. The point about this second group is that even though they might start off with little money, they'll learn fast with the help of AI tutors and soon be able to find ways to use their limited AI budget to fund a bigger AI budget in a kind of feedback loop that lets them become wealthier. High natural agency will beget even higher boosted agency. And look, I certainly don't want to bemoan those with get up and go. Quite the opposite. They actually inspire me to try and get myself a little bit more together. After all, as I've said, I think we should be championing, promoting, and protecting human agency. My worry is how do we politically manage the potentially massive growth in the gap between those with the highest levels of AI-boosted agency and those with lower agency. Indeed, I think this gap could become the new kind of class divide that is even more important to think about than wealth inequality alone. Because we can imagine some key issues where the interests of these two classes are in serious tension. The first tension between those with the highest level of agency and everyone else is the classic divide over who gets to keep the wealth being created by a society. The problem here is that, irrespective of whether they are personally wealthy or not yet, those with high agency are often seduced by hardcore libertarian narratives, like those in the book The Sovereign Individual, that try to argue that it is only the hardworking, high-agency, cognitive elite who are generating all of society's wealth. So why should they pay taxes to encourage and support the laziness of the lower agency masses? These kinds of narratives totally ignore that capitalism, and now AI too, enable an intense feedback loop that unfairly magnifies small differences in agency, talent, and especially luck into huge differences in wealth outcomes, and indeed in agency outcomes. Rich people rarely deserve all of their wealth, so Tax is not theft. Rather, at the very least, tax is one way to fix a failure of the market, to fairly compensate everyone else in society who are also hardworking and who contribute to the conditions which enable wealth to be created. And there are other reasons for collecting tax too. But ironically, those who already have the highest agency will be the most acutely aware of any actions being taken by government that they feel limits their agency, whether it's taxing their wealth or regulating their attempts to influence others or whatever. They'll rail against any such restrictions of their complete freedom. After all, don't we all want freedom? Aren't we meant to be in a free society? Yeah, but as I've been saying, there's an important difference between having legal freedoms and having the genuine agency to make meaningful choices over your life. And the high agency of the powerful is often used to diminish the agency of everyone else, even if we all still have the same legal freedoms. At this point, it's worth noting that in the past, and still today, capitalists need workers to run their factories and to do other essential work for society. So the capitalists can't be too brutally detached from the well-being and interests of the workers, yet. And in some important sense, it was in the context of this forced compromise that mass democracy came about. But if AI tools and robots can, in time, essentially replace most of the lower agency jobs, then even this kind of minimal shared interest between capitalists and workers breaks down. In time, those with high agency could simply end up with no economic need for, and therefore no solidarity with, those of lower agency. Instead, they'll just see them as a problem to manage. So instead of wanting a liberal democracy where everyone has independent agency, they'll want a managed democracy where choices are limited and the information landscape is manipulated. And I know many would say that that is basically what we're living with now. But I think the advent of powerful AI will supercharge this tension in a way that threatens even the minimal democracy we have today. And there are influential voices like Curtis Yarvin who are essentially cheering this on, arguing instead for a monarchical rule by a CEO technocrat. Sounds all too familiar. So in some sense, the reason for this whole video is because I think we should consider shifting the discussion away from focusing on wealth inequality as the key class divide, but to instead be focusing on agency. Yes, of course, the two are very much linked, but I think many people actually care less about the wealth gap than they do about the influence gap. For example, a typical university lecturer knows that they are choosing a career that won't earn them as much money as, say, a city job. They're choosing to have a life of teaching and researching rather than of buying yachts and luxury cars. They know that. But that doesn't mean they want to have less agency over their lives or how society progresses. Often quite the reverse. So why have we set up our societies so that the wealthy can have such a disproportionate level of influence over our politics? That doesn't make any sense at all, and we should change it. That's why, for example, there should be limits on political donations by individuals. That's why there should be ownership limits and sensible regulations on mass media platforms in order to promote a healthy, diverse information landscape. Indeed, that's why we should have some kind of proportional representation so that we can have new parties that aren't captured by wealthy corporate lobbyists. But, of course, these are regulations that trim a little of the agency from those who already have the highest levels of agency. So this is another reason why there's a tension here between those with the highest agency and everyone else. It's in the interests of most of us that we should use our democratic nation-states in order to protect and promote the conditions that allow everyone to have genuine agency over their lives. And again, this isn't just because it's the right thing to do. It's also because if the crowd doesn't have genuine independent agency, then there is no wisdom in the behavior of that crowd, no wisdom in its democratic choices, and no wisdom in its market behavior. So to me, this seems to be the new dividing line in our politics. Are you in favor of genuine agency for everyone, or in favor of complete freedom for the powerful? You simply can't pick both. To underscore why I think we should be focusing on the agency gap even more than the wealth gap, let's just briefly look at the idea of universal basic income, UBI. If the progress of AI does indeed remove large numbers of paying jobs from the labour market, then we may well have to introduce some kind of UBI in order to make sure that everyone in society has at least some purchasing power for their family. This certainly solves a basic survival problem. But money alone doesn't give people agency over their lives. For example, if the markets they are using that money in are monopolies or heavily distorted markets, then they still won't be living in conditions that give them any real agency over their choices. They'll have to buy from that one company, and so the UBI might as well be a direct government subsidy to that company. Yes, the oligarchs might make large profits this way, but UBI alone won't help ensure that there's any wisdom being expressed by the crowd here. It won't make this a healthy, anti-fragile market with innovative, creative destruction. It'll be a purely extractive, captured market. And much more obviously, UBI doesn't solve the problem of how to have real agency in our democracy. Fundamentally, wealth redistribution doesn't itself ensure that there'll be wisdom in the crowds. That's why I think we need to keep the focus on human agency and try to reduce the human agency gap even more urgently than the wealth gap. More than freedom, we should demand agency. But what do you think of all this? I'm very curious to hear in the comments below what connections you think I should be making with these ideas. And what are the holes in these thoughts? And please do click on the like button if you enjoyed this video and subscribe to see more videos like this. Thank you for watching.